while the crowd is gathering, let me just share a couple of insights or observations to make. We do have some resources posted again in box, the UMKC Midwest Center box for this session. I've got a couple of resources that I will refer specifically to and talk about, and I thought you would want them because they're very substantial. So we have a couple of different items called Reboot from PwC, the consulting firm that used to be PricewaterhouseCoopers. And I'll talk about those when we get into it. In addition, we have a highlight from Charities Aid Foundation of America, a very elaborate but very interesting report produced just a couple of months ago about what nonprofits in the U.S. are doing in terms of, they call it future-proofing and transitioning the nonprofit community, and highlighting some things that were discussed, or I shouldn't say discussed, they were identified as big challenges and things that people think have improved or have developed during the pandemic that are beneficial. The other thing that is a little bit more about facilities, and if you've got food service operations and things like that, it's going to be especially interesting, is a tool called Together We Rise, checklists for operating your business safely, from Sodexo, which of course has facilities and food service and all of that. Those things are posted, and then I'm also going to talk a little bit about using a thing called the Fishbone Diagram. So we have a very simple version of that that's posted on the, in the box there for you to download and use, and hopefully find them of interest. As usual, it's good to see you all for today's session. We are back in the same mode, nonprofit navigation series, with Cindy Law for monitoring chat. Mark Culver is staffing and letting people in, and we're getting folks in even still as we're talking about the layout for the morning. Our agenda for today is going to be focused, of course, on, are we there yet? I don't know if you like the title or not, but I kept hearing that from my kids when I was raising kids, and it kind of reminded me of where we are now. Now the question is, do we want to be there or not? And that's part of what we'll be talking about. So when we're coming out of this experience that we've been having, the pandemic, the recession, some of the other things that are going on, what does it mean to come back? We'll talk about rebooting, and we have the materials that I mentioned to you a few minutes ago from PwC are actually checklist. One of them is a question and answer checklist. The other is a general checklist, and I think that you'll find them interesting. I'll be talking about those, and then using this notion of fishbone diagram. How do you use that to help with your own team in your own place? And then I do want to end with a little more of an emphasis on something we've talked about from time to time in this series, as well as in other settings, and that's supporting people, the dimensions of really providing support to folks today. Let's get into it. First off, the question is often asked about getting back to work, and it's kind of treated like a binary choice, but we really need to be thinking about it in a more nuanced way. It's actually a question that's complex and very sort of related to the nature of your organization, your size, the mission, the nature of the constituencies you're serving. Obviously, things are different if you're a performing arts organization as opposed to an emergency assistance organization. And so for a general session like this, we're obviously stuck with doing very general kinds of thinking. We're sharing tools that are going to, I guess, raise the questions, but the whole point is this is a framework for you to work with your team and think about what is it that actually is going to be of most value and benefit to your organization. So, fundamentally, we need to be thinking about planning, preparing, transitioning, and supporting our people. So, well, who are our people? I just want to remind you that it's easy to focus on one or two of our core stakeholders and constituencies, but we need to be thinking about everybody. And so we're looking at folks who are tied to the organization more directly, employees, contractors, even the board. And of course, folks are involved in varying degrees of engagement already. So we're not starting from zero. And that's part of what we have to be working with and building on as we're looking ahead. We also need to be thinking about volunteers, if that's a significant part of our workforce in our labor pool. We're clearly needing to think specifically about clients, and that may not be just one category even. So depending on the nature and mix of your service portfolio, you may be dealing with many very different kinds of clients, some who have certain needs, characteristics, and interests, and others who have very different needs and interests. I also want to remind you that for most of us, we do need to think about visitors and thinking in each of these cases, what are their needs? What are their interests? What are their concerns? To use a phrase that we've sometimes used in our sessions on design thinking, you know, what are their pain points? What are the things that we need to help address in order for them to be comfortable, equipped, and ready to engage with each other in this new mode, which is our next normal? I know to what degree is it a new normal or not? We'll have to talk about that when we get into our discussion, perhaps. As I note on the slide, and I'll flag these a couple of times, we've talked about a couple of topics that I think are going to be useful if you want to get into more depth on a couple of these things, to go back to earlier navigation series sessions. They're in the archives for the navigation series. The one that I'm highlighting here, because it is fundamentally focused on how do we think about problems and meeting the needs of the people with whom we engage, is the design thinking sessions that we did last, a little less than a year ago. It was probably last September when we actually were in that. Now, I'm gonna go for a second, stop the share and go to a different screen, just so you can see what I'm referring to when I'm coming back. And again, for those of you, I don't know if this got boxed out or eliminated when I was in my shifted to mute for a second or not, but the consulting firm PwC has produced two very useful resources that are in the box, the resources box for this session. One is called Reboot, Getting Back to the Workplace. I'll be using that as a framework for my comments for the next few minutes. There's also another thing that's much more of a checklist. Now, it's kind of a daunting checklist, really, but the thing that I think is so useful is that it's kind of like an exceptional menu. And while it could be overwhelming to look at all of these questions, the value of this is that it does identify in a relatively comprehensive way the kinds of questions you need to think about, you know, sort of item by item by item. My suggestion is, you'll see when we get back to our subsequent parts of the presentation, is that you actually use tools like that as stimulus for you to talk with your work teams and maybe, excuse me, with other constituents about what does it mean for us? What do we want it to mean for us to get back to the workplace? One of the key things that I think we have to remember, it's so obvious that I don't always see it highlighted, is the importance throughout this whole thing of exercising and demonstrating effective leadership, staying in touch with people, facilitating dialogue, helping people figure out collectively together what it is we want to do, and being sure to try to communicate. And I will, again, going back to another navigation session that I'll refer to at the end, we talked about supporting people through times of transformational change, which I think we're in and will be through this whole process. A critical issue is communication, helping everybody have their communication needs, their engagement needs met. And of course, you can never communicate enough that everybody will be satisfied. That doesn't mean don't do it. It means try to be thoughtful about addressing it from multiple perspectives. So the reality is, one of the things we have to do is help people keep an optimistic focus and an orientation, even while we try to achieve clarity about what it is that we're progressing through. And I would suggest that for most of us, it's going to be important that we work with our teams to think about our return, or, it's really, the phrases like the label of the resource item is back. I don't think we're going back. And my own bias is that we're going to the next stage of our operations and development. So when we're thinking that through, in deciding how do we want the next stage to be, and frankly, we've made some exceptional advances and innovations in certain things. I realize not everybody thinks Zoom is an innovation, but this is the kind of stuff that we don't want to lose some of the great pilot tests that we've been doing. We just want to think about them critically and ask, what is their place in a more well-rounded operating model for the next generation of our work? But one of the things that's really going to be an issue, especially as you have varying levels of confidence and comfort with the processes we're engaging in as we move to the next stage of our workplace operations, is to try to help address it from a problem-solving perspective. I think it's really critical that we try to communicate and engage with trust. I will say honestly, I've observed a number of organizations, managers and leaders who've had a little trouble with trust, because it's kind of like, wow, everybody's working remotely. How do I know they're working? Let's just find a way to work together and move ahead as we're engaging in, and frankly, assuming the best from each other, even though, there are going to be times when there may be some challenges along the way. We need, of course, to develop a plan and a strategy. And again, from a resource point of view, let me point out that the detailed question list that I showed you a couple minutes ago are tied to these topics in the PwC handout. So that's a tool that I would encourage you to look at for very specific questions that you might think to help you address and weigh what it is that we're doing with these kinds of topics. So the lead and communicate, of course, is something that has to go on all the way. You've certainly been developing plans and strategies, but now the question is, what's the next stage? Where are we going? And what is it that belongs in the next stage? Focusing on productivity, of course, how we work. But again, going back to that previous slide, just those generic categories of people, we need to be thinking about how each of our categories of constituents is working, including, for example, by the way, the board. When and how do we transition to the next stage in the way we work with our board? How do we do it with our management team? How do we do it with the people who are delivering services and our clients? When I say how you work, this is their word, but the reality is we're probably talking about how do we work and how do we want to work. If you have a more substantially developed organization, maybe you want to develop a workplace playbook, which is a place that you can put all of your plans and organize it and make it accessible in multiple ways on a website, as well as communicating it in meetings and so on, as a way of helping people stay up to date. One of the problems with transitions, such as the one that we're in right now, is that things logically have to keep changing and evolving, but people can't keep up. And depending on when they're paying attention, they may or may not be hearing some of the key things that they need to know to stay in sync and keep in balance with the mode of organization and operation that you're engaged in. One of the things, of course, that we have to assume, some of you no doubt are already worrying about this, or at least paying attention to it in a very significant way, is this whole category of managing for health and safety. Clearly, that's got to guide, it's got to be a fundamental guide for when and how our people come back. The people meaning, of course, again, the associates of the organization, the clients, everybody who's engaged with us, vendors. I mean, anybody who's in contact with us. You've undoubtedly thought about aspects of this during the more extreme conditions of the pandemic, but as we're moving back, we have to be explicit about, well, what are the layers of returning? One of the observations that the PwC team has made from their work, and I think it's a good observation, is when you're thinking about the notion of phased return to work, think of it by elements, the work elements that are most critical to the success and performance and impact of your organization. Don't go, and I will admit that I sometimes think first about this, but don't go by dates. Go by the nature of the work. And you have to phrase it, of course, in a way that it's not disrespectful when you're saying, I want certain people here sooner than others because they're more essential to this or that. I'm a former government official, as some of you know, and one of the things in Minnesota, where every now and then we would have snow days. You know, imagine that in Minnesota. But anyway, you know, we'd get an announcement from the governor's office to all of us who are state employees saying, well, the only people who should come to work today are essential employees. Well, I mean, that kind of made me thinking about, I kind of thought I was essential, but, you know, I don't have to be there. I think finding the right verbiage, sometimes these things can stick in people's craw a bit if we don't choose our words carefully. And it's hard to choose them all carefully when you've got so many things going on. But, you know, figure out what it is, and in the way of categories of work, the natures of the client population that you most need to serve. Now, of course, some of you are engaged with your clients every day already because of the nature of the work you do. Again, that's one of the challenges of a session like this. And it's why I suggest, as I'll get to in a couple of minutes, that a critical part of operationalizing this rebooting process is using work teams for engagement and involvement in your organization, bringing in, to some extent, key clients when that's feasible, to help you make plans about what it is you want to be doing. Now, one of the things that unfortunately we're going to have to keep thinking about is this question of, you know, of actual safety and wellness. And we're going to need to figure out, you know, what are the true risks, nature of risks, and how do we manage them, and how do we monitor our status. The truth is, unless this is unlike any major change that we've ever experienced, it's not going to be a regular linear process up. We're going to end up with moving forward and then taking a couple of steps back. And we're going to have to own that and just help people expect it. That, to me, goes back to the category of leading and communicating the changes, which is, you know what, let's all work together and identify earlier rather than later if it's a safety or health risk, when we need to step back for a bit. And I would suggest that there's a degree of scenario planning, another one of our earlier sessions from last year. Engage in a bit of scenario planning around the most important in the sense of they may create important risks that you need to be monitoring and managing as you progress back to or over to the next stage of your work. This health question and being very clear about when should people be at work, when should they not be at work, or let me rephrase that. When they should be at work, but then the intermediate stages are, you know, they should be working, but they should not be on site. And many of you, of course, are in situations where you have staged work activities, so not everybody's in the workplace at the same time. Continuing with the theme of the reboot resource from PwC, obviously one of the things we have to be rethinking, undoubtedly many of you have already been rethinking it, are about the facilities and technology. We've certainly done a lot of fast adaptation with regard to technology as people move to remote work. One of the things we're going to have to think about now is the next normal is going to have a similarly diverse array of work arrangements, but we're going to have to be thinking about and planning explicitly, team by team and even job by job. Well, who should be here when and in what ways? And of course, some organizations have the resources, the technology, and the expertise that they're able to get very elaborate. One of my good friends works for a large law firm, and every one of the employees at the law firm wears a monitor bracelet every day that they're in the workplace, and that technology tracks when they get too close to each other, or at least when they get close to each other. And if they need to go back and do tracing because illnesses start to pop up in the workplace, their computer system tells them, well, who's been close to whom and where did, you know, once they know someone's ill, they can track back and make sure that other people quarantine or work away from the office or whatever. Most of us don't have that kind of an asset or a resource, but we do have our own ways. And I think this is an opportunity to get clear and even creative with your staff. How do we go back? It is, in fact, a great time to rethink some of the things that maybe were time wasters and we just didn't get that much value from them before. And so this is a time when we actually can make changes, and it makes more sense to folks. It'll maybe be met with a little bit more optimism or at least acceptance. One of the things that's critical, though, and we know this from all of the transition support work that we do, is that changes that we make in how people work require us to help them prepare to be successful in their roles. And so that means training and education, probably means regular checking in, including work teams and other groups, about how's it going. And, you know, before things get to be big problems or things break down, just checking in. And of course, we've had to do these things, but people have all been so remote, they haven't been in physical space as much in most places as they will have to be as we start making our transition to the next stage. And we have to keep expecting to pay attention to the changing conditions. You know, we don't know, vaccinations and all of that seem to be making things work fairly well in many parts of the US right now, but the reality is this stuff's not going to be that even progression. So one of the things that I hope you've already done, another thing we talked about in the early days of our navigation series, was making sure that you went back, your leadership team went back to saying, well, what's at the core? What's the focus, the core focus of what we must do, even if some other things can be put on hold? Go back and review those decisions. By the way, sometimes people sort of accidentally got into certain modes of operation. This is a time when you both have the opportunity, but also I would say the imperative of coming back to those kinds of lists and rethinking. And it's kind of a tiered thing. What happens now? What happens in the next 6 weeks? What happens in the next quarter and beyond? And layer this. I'm sure for at least a few of you, you're feeling like I am when I think about this, which is, wow, that makes me tired just thinking about this. But the thing is, this is leadership and management. It's critical, and we just need to find the best way we can to work with our teams and try to share the load, work with your board as well as with your executive and staff teams. And if volunteers are a significant part of your operation, that's critical as well. The last thing I want to highlight from the PwC information, but then, you know, the thing is, it's going to be something we'll continue to talk about a little bit more as we go through this session. We've got to be very empathetic. I think many of you have experienced both the need and hopefully the grace of people being respectful and responsive to each other as we each try to make our way through with the individual challenges and problems that each of us has because of the job or our individual work circumstances, and we just have to keep trying to adapt. But it's time to go back and think, as we make the progression to the next normal, about our policies and the culture we want for our organization. The reality is we've disrupted our culture in our organizations, even without knowing it, just because we had to shift to remote work. I imagine if you've had remote work going on with your operation, you've seen some of the signs of it, hopefully some positive, but certainly some negative. Just people not being together as often. There's nothing like a pandemic and the conditions we've been going through to help you realize when things got done because people just happened to be in interaction with each other in a common workplace. And when we went remote, the question was, well, where was the common workplace? We've had to create virtual, Microsoft Teams or Zoom or whatever vehicles you're using, but we've had to create these virtual interaction places, but they've required more intentionality. And of course, we've heard people often talking about the downside, which is just the fatigue of being on a monitor, on a Zoom for hours and hours every day. Thank you for being with us on Zoom today. But the question for the next normal is, what are the policies we have now that we should either refine or change? How do we sustain or maybe regrow the culture that we need and want in our operation, and we haven't had it for a little while because it's not been feasible. So one of the things that this is critical, clearly, goes without saying, I guess, but be sensitive to the situations that our people face. But again, part of my pitch here is be intentional about identifying categories of people affected by our transition to the next generation of workplace operations, because it's going to be, as we said earlier, you've got board, you've got staff, you've got volunteers, you have different categories of clients, and obviously it's going to be different if you're working with kind of hands-on services like physical therapy versus the kind of services where you can be more remote or even just more distanced. And of course, your facilities are going to influence that as well. In terms of being empathetic and trying to affirm and refine the policies that most support what you aspire to have be your culture for your next generation of work, don't do this alone in a corner. Get people together and talk about what has and hasn't had an impact on their activities and their work. And then, try to use reflection and processing. Along the way, though, it is a chance to think about that question of, well, what are the things that have blocked productivity? Maybe they weren't working well before when everybody was in the workspace, common shared workspace, but we've created a lot of new habits and sort of modes of operating that were the temporary transitional mode of remote working. And in some cases, we're going to have to go back. And it was good enough to just keep things moving, but we really do know, if we reflect on it, that this is not quite what we need in the way of intensity and performance and impact as we move ahead. So the things I've been talking about here are in the two documents that are described as reboot documents in the box, and I encourage you to take a look at those as we go there. Now, in terms of actually making this work in your own organization, I consider all the reboot topics, the questions in those frameworks and all those things, they're kind of like a menu of things to consider. But when we're actually doing it in a typical agency, most of which are not going to be as large as a lot of the organizations that the consultants were talking about, how might we actually focus in on the most important things? For those of you who've got experience with or been trained in Six Sigma, Lean Six Sigma, or if you're really old like me, Total Quality Management, which is morphed into all these new layers, one of the tried and true tools that I think is actually a nice vehicle for bringing people together and keeping the focus on the challenges and needs for the future versus just saying, what did you like and what did you not like, is this diagram and the process of completing it. It's called the Fishbone Diagram because it looks like a fish, or at least it looks like a fishbone map. Technically, it's the Ishikawa diagram, and it provides a framework for thinking about what things lead to what thing. I mean, technically, it's sometimes referred to as a root causes diagram because you're taking an outcome or a condition and you're working your way back, as I'll illustrate in a second, to say, what do we need to do with individual pieces in order to yield the result or avoid the problem that the diagram is used. It's often used to analyze quality failures, but it doesn't have to be. It's a good discussion and interaction activity, and that's why I really think that it's a tool for bringing people together. Even the act of working through this helps people come together to talk about what they aspire to see and we need to have in place as we return or move to the next stage of our work. So here's the simplistic version of an Ishikawa, Ishikawa or fishbone diagram. And again, the idea here is if we're thinking about returning to or going to the next level of operation with a safe and functional workplace, what are the categories that we need to be thinking about? In a sense, you saw them listed in the PwC document, but I've highlighted them in general. By the way, some fishbone templates are very cute. All the words start with M, like instead of leadership, it says management. And you've got materials, instead of equipment, it says machines. But in an effort to be slightly more clear about this whole thing, I thought I would lay it out this way, because this is the set of key things that we want to be working through. And some of them are going to be more important than others. But the idea of the Ishikawa diagram is to talk about, and it starts off as somewhat of a brainstorming, but it's brainstorming grounded in the realities of what people are experiencing. This isn't like visioning, because you're not talking about what do we aspire to. We're talking about what actually is in place that we need to address and either amplify, retain, modify, or get rid of in order to yield the result, which is that safe and functional workplace, a place that people want to work. These are not all going to have the same number of elements, but the question to think about, and by the way, it's often considered a fishbone diagram because if it's like the fish that I like to eat, trout, there are a lot of bones that are always off other bones. So you may have the general category of leadership. You should, I believe that all 6 of these categories are important, but then the question is, well, what are the aspects of leadership that we should be thinking about? Excuse me. And maybe even there's an offshoot from that, which is, okay, we've got leadership, which is that our teams haven't had regular meetings, and so we're not so much in connections. And then the offshoot from that is people are in varying stages of readiness to meet again, and so we need to think about that. Sometimes you'll even get more elaborate in that way and add another factor. The idea is these are increasingly detailed elements that add up to effective leadership that contributes to safe and functional workplace. And again, having work team discussions where you can actually talk about these things with the people who are front and center and experiencing them can be very valuable and beneficial. So I've suggested that we should be looking at leadership. We should be looking at people and supporting people along the way. We've created habits and other things. For example, just to say, well, what's an issue that might need to be addressed on the people side? Well, it's, people are not used to working back together in a place with each other. And so we need to, we need to address that. Well, what might be in the way or needed to help that? Well, maybe we need to help people reconnect because they may not know each other. I mean, believe it or not, after 15 months of going through this stuff, we may have folks who've been on teams together, but they're actually not all that well in touch with each other in terms of what's happened in their lives and what's gone on from there. So the idea is that you use the diagram, and there is a sort of a blank template that's just a simple diagram posted in box that you can use if you have an interest in doing it. Now, the truth is when it's finished, it looks something like this. Now, again, here, the example here that this vendor was using was, okay, we've got people missing deadlines. So what are the things that contribute to missed deadlines? You've got the people factors, you've got methods, and I have called them processes, but what are our processes? What are our equipment? What's going on in the environment that may be an issue? What are the things that add up to that result or need to be changed to add up to that result? And my pitch is, use this little tool to work through this. It's really, I think, an opportunity to take what could be really overwhelming, that list from the PwC handouts, but invite people to look at it and then just invite them to go back and say, well, which of the things are actually relevant in our workplace, maybe our smaller workplace or a more dispersed workplace? What do we need to do? I would say candidly, some of this stuff is, it should be pretty pragmatic. If I think, for example, about some of the work we've been doing at the block school at UMKC, Midwest Center, but especially faculty, when we had to work remotely, when that was the answer over here, the school started handing out equipment right and left to faculty members. So one of the things that I would put on this list for equipment if I was doing this for the block school is we've got to find all this equipment that faculty took. I mean, not inappropriately, they were told to take it. Go home and do your Zoom classes from your home office or from some other place, things like that. So, finding equipment. Is regaining connections in the workplace where it needs to be? What's the new balance of equipment when we have folks who are working remotely some of the time, perhaps even into the future, but increasingly back in the office? And how do we handle what may actually feel like it's more of an awkward stage of a hybrid where people are moving back to the more conventional mode that we once had, but we still have to be able to work remotely, and especially that's a safety factor if we're dealing with the question of a reinfection of people in the workplace. So just working in general with those categories that I highlighted on the Ishikawa there. So if we work from the 6 categories that are there, you know, what do we need to do in our own organization with leadership and management? Maybe you have a very small management team, and maybe you've got a very shared leadership process or approach in your team. You know, bring the team together. We need to be figuring out, what do we need to address with regard to communication and motivation of the people involved in our work? And again, people including not just the employees who are providing services, but the clients. You know, maybe we need to encourage them to get back into the game. Maybe we need to revise our structure and our policies. One of the things that I was hearing about just before our session this morning was an organization in town that really wants all of its personnel to be vaccinated so that they feel more comfortable and safe about them all being back on a common facility, in their common facilities. And so they have actually created a financial incentive program, $150, $250, whatever makes sense in your case, but maybe you need to create some incentives along the way. The description I heard described at one point was trying to figure out when the balance should be achieved by the carrot versus the stick. Now, which processes, and this is, you know, this is of course especially significant in the context of your own organization. We can't give you a generic list, but what are the work systems and functions that are going to remain the same as you continue into your next normal, and which need to change, and how much? Are you going to be doing certain things on site that today are remote, or they're not done at all? Down the road, are you going to allow people to work remotely, even though it's not a necessity from a health or well-being perspective? Well, maybe it's well-being, but it's the mental health well-being of, you know, not being in the workplace all the time, providing more flexibility for people in the jobs they're in. I would, by the way, go back and remind you of one of the observations that was shared earlier on, that notion of don't just adopt blanket transition plans and say, we're going to do these by dates. You want to do it by functions and jobs and roles, and then tie the dates as a result of what you know about what needs to happen. Going back and reevaluating the equipment needs, what tools and equipment are needed and where, and with what levels of accessibility. You know, the materials question, often we don't have a lot of materials in the nonprofit sector, but of course that depends by mission. But even just the things like health, safety, and cleaning supplies, where do we need those supplies and when? Are we ready to handle that? So many organizations really jumped in very quickly, and of course created a real challenge in the marketplace around the you know, hand sanitizer and PPE, personal protective equipment, things like that. But as we're looking at the transition to the next normal with more people, more in engagement with each other, what do we retain, what do we adapt, and what is it that we're maybe able to at least put away and keep in storage, unless we, you know, for the case of a resurgence of the health problems or things like that. You know, going back and rethinking what is among the more optimal of work environments on and off premises as we move to the next stage. It may have been acceptable and necessary for people to work remotely, but you really are but you've paid a price perhaps. We need to have people back in, and we need to have coordination about who and where and how people are trying to work together. One of the things that I encountered with a few of the organizations that I've worked with during this pandemic time is that there were a couple of people who had to be in the office, so they were there all the time. So everybody who was working remotely would just zap them a note or get on the phone or get on a Zoom or a team meeting and say, hey, since you're there, would you do this and this and this? Well, you know, that works for a little while, but if somebody feels like they're being called upon to do 10% of somebody else's job in addition to their own job, we have to rethink. Maybe there's a new balance as we move to the next stage. And last but not least is the whole people end of things. How do we make sure that we affirm the best of the culture that carried us through the pandemic, but then move forward with trying to really think about the team climate, the connection. If you're working in the context of people who need to be able to work together, you know, how do we sustain or even enrich the team climate for the next stage, recognizing that we may still have some remote and some on-site work going on in many cases. And then the last category that I want to raise is actually an elaboration of that people category, but it's talking about something that when I went back and looked at the records, ironically, it was almost exactly a year ago, April 28th of 2020, we presented a navigation series session on supporting your people through a time of transformative change. There were resource documents there that I think you may find helpful in terms of informing your organization's efforts to help associates, clients, volunteers, community collaborators, and others, you know, the people aspects of this, apart from the operations. A couple of the things just to recap, when we presented that session, and it's a model that was developed by a guy named William Bridges, just to give him credit. Effective organizations and leaders provide support for people as they make their way through transitional processes. And as we described then, this is actually a flow of a process that has to progress from an ending and letting go stage. And of course, the processes, the challenges we've been in for the last 14, 15 months have been about ending and letting go. But some people maybe didn't let go because they said, well, this is a temporary state and we're going to go back to the way we were. Our pitch is for most operations, we're going to go to a new normal, not the old normal. And so we need to help support people as they go through this. And one of the things we described in that session was the need to help people deal with the sense of loss. A lot of people have already been grieving and feeling a sense of loss because they weren't able to be together in the workplace in the form of engagement that they knew. We're having to move, and one of the things, ironically, is as things calm down and shift to this next normal, some people who just kind of held off in the back of their head, oh, someday this will be over and we'll go back to the old way, they're actually going to start feeling the pressure and the grieving, the sense of unhappiness and grieving loss, because it's now going to become clear certain things will never go back to the way they were. And I was kind of hoping, you know, maybe they were in some cases. So people go through this at their own pace, and it varies by many factors. But we have to help people to let go and, you know, not say it's a good thing it's over, but just letting go and moving to the next stage. I will say candidly, I think some people are going to have a challenge with letting go of the flexibility and the sense of energy that came with jumping up and responding to the challenges of the pandemic. Now, the Bridges model that we like and that we share in that session, just again to highlight a couple of the points, I think it's really critical to recognize this concept that they call the neutral zone, which is between ending and letting go and the new beginning, the new stage, the next normal. We're in a neutral zone. We're all in a neutral zone to some degree or another right now, but we need to continue to move ahead to what ultimately would be the quote unquote new beginning, or maybe, you know, the next normal, whatever you want to call it. When we are supporting people as they go through the neutral zone, it's some of the things that we know from the research and our practices on this that are really important to help people with are nurturing and building the sense of community. Thinking, you know, during the neutral zone, we create a lot of temporary support structures, but you know what? One of the things we have to figure out is which of those are going to become permanent, which of those need to end. And one of the real problems in the transition from neutral to new beginning is that people can't figure out when we're leaving the middle and going to the next stage. This is why teamwork, communications, interaction is so significant, so important along the way. We need to work together to help people both experience or recognize, but then go through that. And some people are going to be more challenged than others. One of the things we shared at that time was an ambiguity tolerance inventory. You can find that in the materials there if you're interested in. Some people are a lot more freaked out by ambiguity and uncertainty. And we are creating another cycle of ambiguity and uncertainty as we move from the temporary pandemic modes to the next normal, especially if we're not taking care to clarify what is that next normal, what's that going to be like. And so helping people figure out how is this going to play out, what do we need to do to support each other, constantly working on that old standby communications. But again, part of the thing that I think we really need to work to reinforce is the community and recapturing some of the sense of community that maybe was diluted a bit. But in some cases, you may have actually gained a much stronger sense of community, and the intensity of the transition process will moderate. As we go through this, though, as I said, it's not going to be a linear process that's continually upward. We're going to have setbacks. And so we need to recognize that and support each other as people kind of get freaked out. And it's kind of like, well, I don't know why I'm so upset about this. Well, it just happens that this is the way it is sometimes. And then as we get to that new beginning, the thing is, keep your communications going and be sure that you do eliminate any of the temporary structures and be clear about when. Now, by the way, a structure may sound like, well, it's something physical. One of the most common structures that changed during the pandemic was all of the set of policies about when and how you engaged in work, and it counted as work and you were credited with doing work during times that you were working remotely. That is a form of structure as well. Working remotely was an interim structure, and as we have staged transitions to the next normal, the question is, do people know where they fit? Do we have clarity for the organization and the work in it? But ultimately, it has to be for each individual as well. And we talked about the 4 Ps in that session. I encourage you to go back and take a look at that, because what it is you know, some people care more about the vision or purpose and what it is we're going to be doing with this next normal. Some people want to know more about the vision and what it is that we aspire to see in the next level. A lot of people, when they're going through changes, worry about people and relationships and things like that. And still others worry about the details, the plans. We need to be working on all 4 of these categories, and different people pay attention to 1 or 2 of them more than the others. So with that, I'm going to leave the slide up for only a second because I want to spend the remainder of our time just inviting you to talk about what has been your experience if you have been making a transition to a next normal. What has been your experience? And one of the questions we need to keep asking ourselves is, what have you learned? Or maybe if you haven't thought about it before now, what should you learn from it? Welcome some observations. Have you been going through? I'm sure many of you are going through some of this. I mean, I've talked to many of you about things that your organizations are doing with regard to certain transitions already. What would you offer? Just a 15 or 20 second highlight of your experience. Just unmute yourself. You can chat if you want, but I think it's better if you just unmute yourself and tell us, we made this and I've learned this. Do you have a key takeaway that we should share with each other here?
Dave, can you real quick, just, we've had some talk about the Fishbone Diagram. There's an interest in that, and I think most people hopefully have found the worksheet that you provided. It's in the resources if you have not. But talk a little just about making this their own, that the 6 things that you put up there are definitely a great start, but some people are wondering where some of their ideas fit into it, and that they can make their own branches and how that would work.
Yeah, okay, well, thanks for let me get back to that. what I'm suggesting is that you start with this basic diagram. You know, I mean, again, I'm proposing that it's useful for you as a manager or a leader to, or even for your own job to do this, but I'm suggesting that a way to help people in the organization come together and collectively work to design or refine what's going on for the next generation would be to use this diagram and actually work with, I'm trying to get a color that you'll be able to see. Work with each of these categories. For example, in the conversation with your group, just say, I mean, I wouldn't actually start with leadership because that's among the most important, but that's not what everybody's experiencing. I think I'd start with easy things like what do we need to address in the way of equipment challenges or needs to make sure that we've got the equipment we need in the places we need it at the times we need it to achieve what we want and need. And so literally, that becomes sort of a segment of the discussion where people can then identify, and you can either, I mean, you can like literally have a really big fishbone drawn on a whiteboard or something, and you can draw it, or, I mean, if you've got a small enough group and a big enough whiteboard, put your masks on and have people come up to the board and just maybe write what they feel the things would be for the equipment. In a fishbone, to stay true to the fishbone notion, each one of these would be a sub bone, if you will, off of the big bone. I would start with the simpler things like equipment, materials. Do we have material issues? Some organizations, materials are going to be a big deal, some not so much. And then get into the processes category. And when we're talking about environment, we're talking about the work environment, but we're also talking about the service delivery environment. So if you've been working remotely and clients are going to start coming back into the workplace, this is where, a key part of the safety and health kind of thing is going to come in. And so the discussion with the group would be, well, what are some of the bones, so to speak, that are on that category of environment? So use that. And then after we've talked about some of those things, I would then get into this discussion of the people dynamics. How do we make sure that we maintain, if not enhance, our culture and our ability to work as a team and things like that? And the form that's posted in Box just is incredibly simple. For each of these 6 categories, it says, what are some of the key things we in our workplace need to think about or would be advised to think about along the way? I would treat it initially as a brainstorming discussion to just get people in the unit or work team thinking about it, and then go back and hone in on which are the most important after you've had some time to just get ideas shared. So is anybody who's willing to share an observation? Has anybody made that transition, started making that transition? Bill, you've got your hand up, I think. Bill Sundell, just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to, somebody said something to me a couple days ago that we were talking about an event that we're doing, and like, well, it's not till September. This is the Crossroads Music Fest, is a fundraiser for KKFI. And so I was just sort of spitballing some ideas around what, and so it was my buddy Alex who works at Folk Alliance, and he said, why don't you just make changes that you've been wanting to make for a long time, blame it on COVID, and then, you don't really have to blame it. I mean, they are changes that needed to happen anyway, but I just sort of thought that was a really interesting way to think about the opportunities that this can create is you really can make some drastic changes to your programming or the way you operate, because it needs to be better anyway. And if this is the excuse that makes it happen, then fine.
Yeah, that's a great point. I appreciate you sharing that. One of my favorite quotes, often attributed, but it wasn't his originally, often attributed to Rahm Emanuel, is that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And so, I mean, by the way, one of the most simple early stages of organizational theory and change said, a guy named Kurt Lewin, says, all right, we've got to transition, to make a transition or a change, wanted or not, we have the unfreezing stage. This is kind of like Bridges' 3 stages, but he early days just said, we have the unfreezing stage, we have the change in the middle, and then we have a refreezing stage. And we've been forced into that unfreezing stage by a lot of the dynamics of COVID, the pandemic, and or some of the political and social unrest that's gone on too. It depends on your mission as to which or all of those things are relevant. We are in that unfrozen shifting stage. And one of the warning questions I raised for you is, we're going to refreeze in some mode. And if we're not intentional about it, it's just going to be whatever it lands off being, with whatever incongruities and inconsistencies or even counterproductive elements are there. We need to be intentional about it. And by the way, we're moving toward that. When we get declared, or we do declare that we are in the new normal, the next normal, people are going to start freezing up their methods, their processes, all those things that are in the Ishikawa or the Fishbone Diagram, all those things are going to freeze in some new mode. And the question is it the mode you want? I mean, I'm sure this has not happened in any of your families, but I realized as we were doing our best to raise a couple of teenagers that you didn't pay attention for a little bit and they did certain things and they got away with it. So it's kind of like, oh, good, this works. We're going to do this forever. And then when we finally became aware and alert to the fact that these behaviors were going on, it's kind of like, what made you think you could do that? It's kind of like, well, we got there and nobody stopped us. So that's what it is. I mean, don't you love it? To which my answer was no, but so thanks, Bill. That's a great point. Anybody, we're at 9:30, but I'd love to go for another couple minutes if people have another observation or two that you'd be willing to share.
I've got one. I'm Doug Langner with Bishop Sullivan Center and One City Cafe. So we've been open the whole time, essential workers working with the homeless, and especially in our meal part of it. And so we're in this strange phase now of when is the right time to bring people back inside to dine. We've been doing to go. And our biggest worry, I guess, is in talking with our clients, many of them have not been vaccinated, but there's outside pressure of, well, you got to let people come back in. And it's like, well, are we not thinking about the responsibility for the people we serve too? So really trying to work on getting an on-site vaccination thing, but it is definitely in trying to move into that phase, which we want to do, that there's a lot of pressures from outside to do it, but then the responsibility too you have for the folks we serve is definitely we want to do it right, is the point.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. And I mean, by the way, I feel for you. I mean, it's a time that you've got some exciting opportunities, but the issue is you've also got some very significant threats. I don't think anybody on this call would like your facility to become known as the new next normal super spreader. That sounds to me like something that you would not live down for a long time. I mean, this is where some of that cost benefit thinking needs to be engaged in. And frankly, that sometimes I think, depending on if you've got a governing board, getting a committee of a governing board or a couple of groups thinking about pieces of these things, break them into pieces. But of course, anything you break up, you got to reintegrate. So you got to keep that in mind. But also, this may be a time to engage constituents, like create a short-term advisory council or a little client engagement process. I mean, even using surveys would perhaps allow you to get some of a sense of that. My reaction, Doug, to the situation you described also is, I mean, you've got a lot of worries about making a lot of people sick in a lot of places. Maybe the path you take at best could also create some incentives for folks getting vaccinated. I can't imagine that this would be very easy to implement, but my sort of superficial reaction is, oh, well, you can come in when you show us your vaccine card. So, or maybe you can come in. We still want to serve you. We're in a both and mode for a while because we're providing meals. That's what we're about. But, coming in, is a privilege that has to be, you have to qualify for. Is there one other observation? We'll break in just a minute, but I'd love to hear if anybody else has another observation that would be good to share with the crew.
Dave, I want to just kind of second your thoughts about being flexible and being intentional. I'm doing some, John Amrine, I'm with Michigan State University Extension for those I haven't met. I'm doing some programming with one local or one nonprofit board in a format I never would have done in person. They're a half an hour away. The potentials there are farther distances. I'm dropping into their Zoom board meeting for about 20 minutes each month. Travel time and cost would have just made that prohibitive in person. And so, the folks in my organization who said, oh, we've jumped, to where we would have been 10 years from now anyway in the virtual arena, there's some truth to that. At the same time, I keep going back to those benefits of in-person getting together, conversations before and after meetings, building relationships that are much, much harder to do. And the only way I think we can blend all of that is to be flexible and be intentional.
Yeah. I've had a similar thought. It's funny, I've worked with a few groups on very short or sort of small scale engagements that I never would have done because it's 200 or 300 miles away. But, it's cost effective for them and me to pop in. And like you say, maybe when you're doing board development, it's often good to do bite-sized pieces like 20 minutes at a meeting, but it's not cost effective under the old mode to do that. So yeah, that's, thank you for sharing that. That's great. Well, we've hit 9:36 and I always try to make sure that the group doesn't finish before the facilitator. So thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure. I hope these resources are useful to you. Please go to the box, look at what PwC has in terms of, it's a huge batch of stuff. By the way, that Charities Aid Foundation of America report has some very nice things about the larger transition through the pandemic and what people have gained and been challenged by there. So I encourage you to take a look at all these things and send us notes and follow up if you've got additional questions or thoughts to share. Thank you very much, folks.